Have you ever wondered what would happen if, one day, you were pulled out of your seat, the one you paid for, right in front of dozens of people, just because of the color of your skin, on a first-class flight from New York to Zurich? David Carter, a world-renowned aerospace engineer, and his wife Monica, a celebrated architect admired across Europe, were simply hoping for a peaceful journey, a quiet celebration of their 10th wedding anniversary. But the moment they settled into seats 1A and 1B, a flight attendant with a cold smile and a drunken passenger turned that atmosphere of luxury into something far darker, a deep cut of humiliation. They didn't scream. They didn't argue. Yet just hours later, chaos erupted at Kennedy International Airport when a private jet named Carter 1 blocked the runway, forcing everyone to ask the same question: who really holds the power in the sky? If you've ever believed that justice doesn't need to shout to be heard, hit like, share, and subscribe and follow me through a story that made the whole world stop and think respect can't be bought with a first-class ticket, but it can be lost in a single glance. Early morning in New York. April sunlight spilled through the frosted windows of Kennedy Airport, that kind of clear but chilly light that makes you feel both excited and on guard. In the first-class lounge, David Carter adjusted the mechanical watch on his wrist, an anniversary gift Monica had quietly mailed him the week before, to celebrate their 10 years together. No one in the waiting area knew that the man in the simple gray suit was the chief engineer behind the navigation systems used by some of the world's biggest commercial jets. He didn't talk much. He observed. He had a habit of smiling softly when others spoke, even when nothing was particularly funny. Monica, with her soft curls and impeccable sense of style, was already well known in Europe's architectural circles, the kind of woman who could turn cold concrete into spaces that made people feel respected. They were a successful couple, but never showy. To many, they were the picture of the second-generation American dream, hardworking, educated, accomplished, and above all, graceful. They had every reason to believe that life was smiling back at them. That flight from New York to Zurich was supposed to be just another business trip. But since it happened to fall on their anniversary, they decided to take a short break in the Alps. No meetings, no emails, no stacked-up schedules. A peaceful getaway. Or at least, that's what they thought. When the boarding call echoed through the lounge, David took Monica's hand and said softly, "Let's board early so you won't have to squeeze through the crowd." She smiled that light, effortless smile that made it feel like the world was finally in its right place. The boarding gate opened. The red carpet was already laid out for first-class passengers. Monica's heels tapped in rhythm against the floor, blending with the sound of newspapers flipping in the cabin. Seats 1A and 1B right at the front of the plane. The kind of seats people dream about had been booked 3 weeks in advance. David placed their luggage in the overhead bin, sat down, and looked around. Soft lighting, a faint scent of perfume, the low hum of the air system. Everything exuded luxury, safety, calm. But if you looked closely, you'd notice something off. The chief flight attendant, Karen Miller, lingered her gaze on them just a little too long. It wasn't open hostility. It was that subtle kind of scrutiny, a look that carried quiet suspicion. A look every person of color who's ever stepped into a space that feels too fancy knows all too well. It's the unspoken question behind polite eyes. Do they really belong here? Monica ignored it. She was used to that kind of stare. But David wasn't. As an engineer, he noticed details, micro-expressions, tones, patterns in behavior. He didn't get angry. He simply tilted his head, offered a polite smile, as if to say, "It's okay. I get it." Throughout 10 years of marriage, David and Monica had faced plenty of these moments, the quick side glances at hotel check-ins, the skeptical, and what do you do for a living, the double check of their tickets even after scanning. Every time, they responded with composure, not because they were weak, but because they understood something deeper. Anger only reinforces the prejudice it aims to destroy. But that day, the air felt different. Maybe it was because this trip was special. Maybe because Monica had just received an email. Her Zurich project had been chosen as the green architectural icon of the year. They had every reason to be happy, which is why they never saw the storm quietly building around them. The cabin door closed. Lights dimmed to a soft amber. Engines began to roar. David opened a small book he'd brought along, The Art of Stillness. The first line read, "In an age of motion, stillness is the new luxury." He smiled. He had no idea that within minutes, that stillness would become the only weapon he had left when his dignity was about to be tested. From the back of the cabin came a rough voice. "Excuse me? That's my seat. Mine." A middle-aged man, shirt wrinkled, breath thick with alcohol, staggered forward. Karen, the chief flight attendant, immediately stepped in, her eyes flickering toward David and Monica. The story hadn't even begun, but in that quiet first-class cabin, the air had already fractured. Viewers might not yet know what's about to unfold, but anyone who's ever been looked down on for no good reason can feel that tension, that thin, fragile line between being respected and being doubted. If you were David, what would you do? Stay silent, let it slide just to keep things smooth, or would you stand your ground? Demand fairness right there, under the curious stares of strangers waiting to see how you'd react. That simple question, so small, so human, was the spark that would ignite a global storm. Because just a few hours later, the man asked to give up his seat would be the same one who brought Kennedy Airport to a standstill, forcing one of the world's most prestigious airlines to bow its head in apology. But right now, in this still, fragile moment, no one knows yet. They don't know they're standing on the edge of a lesson. The world will remember a lesson about choosing wisdom over rage, and about the quiet, unshakable power of dignity under fire. There are moments in this world so peaceful, we don't even realize we're standing right before the storm. In that quiet first-class cabin, still and elegant like a gallery, David and Monica Carter believed they were about to enjoy a smooth, uneventful flight. Just like every other business trip. No one knew that. Within minutes, a seemingly small misunderstanding would peel back the polished surface of what we like to call civilized air travel. The Airlux A350 was slowly filling up, the sound of luggage wheels rolling across the floor, soft murmurs of "excuse me" as passengers passed one another. At the front row, Monica flipped open an architecture magazine while David gazed out the window, watching sunlight dance across the silver-white fuselage. Everything felt perfectly ordinary, until he heard heavy footsteps and the sharp scent of whiskey drifting closer. "Hey, excuse me, that's my seat." A hoarse, confident voice laced with challenge. David looked up. The man standing before him was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a wrinkled shirt and a crooked tie. His eyes bloodshot, the kind of man David's instincts told him to keep a distance from. "I'm sorry." "What did you say?" David's voice was calm, polite, but not submissive. The man, who they would later learn was Chad Baxter, gave a smug laugh. "1A, 1B. Those are my seats. I fly this route all the time. Probably just a system mix-up. She must have screwed up." He nodded toward Monica as if she were a flight attendant. That's when Karen Miller, the head flight attendant, appeared. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned up, her smile thin as a razor's edge. She glanced at the name on Chad's ticket, then turned to David, eyes cold. Patience wearing thin. "Mr. Carter, could I please see your ticket again?" Monica frowned slightly. The question sounded polite enough, but there was something about the tone, the way Karen stressed please, something off. David kept his composure, showing a calm, knowing smile as he opened his phone. "We booked these seats 1A and 1B last week. Here's the confirmation from your airline." Karen looked at the screen. For a brief moment, hesitation flickered in her eyes. Then she turned to Chad. "Mr. Baxter, do you have a printed ticket?" Chad dug into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. No QR code, no official boarding pass, just a half-completed reservation. Oh, but Karen said nothing about that. She simply nodded slightly, then faced David again, her voice soft but firm. "We'll have to double-check. In the meantime, would you mind taking seats in the premium economy section, just while we sort this out?" The air dropped a few degrees. Monica looked at David. Her eyes asked silently, "Are they actually asking us to move?" Around them, passengers started glancing, whispering. In that refined, first-class cabin, those looks carried more weight than words ever could. David inhaled slowly. 100 possible reactions raced through his mind, but only one fit the man he wanted to be. He nodded slightly, his tone unnervingly calm. "Thank you, but we'll stay here. Our tickets are valid. Once you check, I'm sure you'll confirm that." Karen didn't respond. Her lips pressed into a hard line as she turned away. Monica's hand brushed his, a gesture that said both "I'm here" and "hold it together." A younger flight attendant approached, trying to diffuse the tension. There could be a system error. "I'll call a supervisor to help." But Karen cut in sharply. "No need. I'm the one in charge here." Each word tightened the air a little more. Chad, feeling the power shift in his favor, smirked and raised his voice. "See, told you. People like them always upgrade by mistake." The cabin fell dead silent. Monica lifted her gaze. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. But the look in her eyes made Karen turn away, if only for a moment. David quietly took out his phone and began recording, not loudly, not dramatically, just instinctively, the way someone does when they know truth often needs witnesses in silence. The tension in the cabin grew taut as wire. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to notice. The wealthy have their own way of avoiding trouble by acting like trouble doesn't exist. Chad slumped into a nearby seat, muttering, "I'll call your supervisor." "Karen, don't let them waste my time." The words only made her more flustered. She adjusted her name tag and spoke into her radio. "Control. I need supervisor support. Passenger non-compliance. Seats 1A, 1B. David turned to Monica, his voice low but clear. "See that we've just become non-compliant passengers." That's how it starts. Monica squeezed his hand tighter. In their eyes, there was no anger, only a quiet fatigue that comes from seeing this story play out too many times. Minutes later, the cabin door opened again. Gary Finch, the flight supervisor, stepped in, middle-aged, tense, tablet in hand. Karen gave her account, emphasizing words like disruptive, security, and refused to move. Gary looked at David, then at Chad, and without asking further, he said, "Sir, ma'am, for the safety of this flight, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane. We'll handle this matter on the ground." Those two words for safety sound polite, almost reasonable, but they're also the coldest words you can use when stripping someone of their dignity. David didn't argue. He simply asked softly, "Are you sure you want to do this before verifying my ticket?" Gary avoided his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. It's procedure." Every passenger watched as they gathered their belongings. Some avoided Monica's gaze. Others looked down, almost apologetic, but no one spoke. In that world, silence is the only armor people have. Before leaving, David turned to Karen. His voice was low but steady. "You've just made a mistake you'll remember for a very long time." Then, looking at Monica, he gave a faint smile. "Let's go. Love. There's more than one way to fly." The cabin door closed behind them. Karen exhaled, thinking she'd handled a minor issue. She had no idea that the man who just walked off that plane had the power to make the entire system she trusted. Neil, downstairs, in the VIP lounge. David unlocked his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His voice was calm, no anger, no fire, just quiet authority. "Eva, I need to depart immediately. Destination Zurich. Use Carter 1. That single line, cool, precise, marked the beginning of a response that would shake an entire airline. Not through shouting, not through outrage, but through the kind of silence that carries real power. There are moments in this world so still, so peaceful, you don't even realize you're standing right before the storm. In that silent first-class cabin, quiet as a museum, David and Monica Carter believed they were about to enjoy a smooth, uneventful flight. Just another business trip. No one knew that. Within minutes, a tiny misunderstanding would strip away the polished mask of what people call airline civility. The Airlux A350 was slowly filling up. Rolling suitcase wheels echoed across the floor. Soft murmurs of "excuse me" slipping between passengers. At the very front, Monica flipped open an architecture magazine, while David leaned toward the window, watching sunlight glint off the silver-white body of the jet. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until he heard heavy footsteps, and the thick, unmistakable smell of whiskey. "Hey, excuse me. That's my seat." The voice was hoarse, confident, and just a little too sure of itself. David looked up. A tall man stood there, shirt wrinkled, tie crooked, eyes red, the kind of man David's instincts told him to stay clear of. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" His tone was calm, polite, but firm. The man later they would learn his name was Chad Baxter. Let out a dry chuckle. "1A and 1B, those are mine. I fly this route all the time. Probably just a system error. She must have messed it up." He tilted his head toward Monica as if talking to an attendant. That's when Karen Miller, the chief flight attendant, arrived. Her blonde hair was pinned tight, her smile thin as a blade. She glanced at the name on Chad's ticket, then looked at David, her eyes cold, already impatient. "Mr. Carter, could you please show me your ticket again?" Monica frowned slightly. The request sounded reasonable, but the way Karen emphasized "please" carried something else entirely. David kept his gentle smile, opened the airline app on his phone. "We booked seats 1A and 1B last week. Here's the confirmation." Karen glanced at the screen, hesitated for a moment, then turned to Chad. "Mr. Baxter, do you have a printed ticket?" Chad dug into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper. No QR code, no official boarding pass, just a half-completed reservation. But Karen said nothing about that. She simply nodded and turned back to David, her tone cool but rigid. "We'll double-check the records. In the meantime, would you mind sitting in the premium economy section while we sort this out?" The air in the cabin dropped. Monica looked at David, her eyes asking silently, "Are they asking us to leave our seats?" Other passengers began to glance over, whispering. In first class. Those glances carry more weight than words ever could. David took a slow breath. 100 responses rushed through his mind, but only one matched the man he wanted to be. He nodded slightly, voice calm and measured. Thank you, but we'll stay here. Our tickets are valid. Once you check, I'm sure you'll confirm that. Karen didn't answer. Her lips pressed together in a line as she turned away. Monica placed a hand on his, part reassurance, part restraint. A younger attendant stepped forward, trying to ease the tension. There might be a system error. I'll call a supervisor. Karen cut her off sharply. No need. I'm in charge here. Each word tightened the air around them, feeling supported. Chad puffed up his chest, raising his voice. See, I told you. They probably got upgraded by mistake. People like that always do. The cabin went silent. Monica lifted her eyes, not crying, not flinching, but the look she gave Karen was enough to make her look away for a split second. David quietly took out his phone and started recording, not to provoke, not to perform, just instinct, the kind of reflex you develop when you've learned that truth sometimes needs to be documented in silence. The tension in the air stretched like a wire. A few passengers shifted in their seats, pretending they hadn't heard. The wealthy have their own way of avoiding trouble by pretending trouble doesn't exist. Chad slumped into a nearby seat, grumbling, I'll call your supervisor. Karen, don't let them waste my time. The remark made Karen's composure falter. She straightened her name tag, picked up her intercom. Control. I need supervisor assistance. Passenger non-compliance. Seats 1A, 1B. David turned to Monica, voice low but steady. You hear that? We're non-compliant passengers now. That's how it starts. Monica squeezed his hand tighter. There was no anger in their eyes, just the tired recognition of a pattern they'd seen too many times before. Minutes later, the cabin door opened. Gary Finch, the flight supervisor, stepped in mid-40s, stern expression, tablet in hand. Karen explained the situation, her voice highlighting words like disruptive, security, and refused to move. Gary looked at David, then at Chad. Without asking a single question, he said, Sir, ma'am, for the safety of this flight, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane. We'll handle this matter on the ground. For safety. Two of the most polite and most chilling words you can use to strip someone of their dignity. David didn't argue. He only asked, quietly, Are you sure you want to do that? Before verifying my ticket? Gary avoided his eyes. I'm sorry, sir. It's policy. Every passenger watched as they gathered their things. Some avoided Monica's gaze. Others lowered their heads as if silently apologizing. But no one spoke. In that world, silence is the only shield people have. Before leaving, David turned to Karen, his voice low but unwavering. You've just made a mistake you'll remember for a very long time. Then he looked at Monica, smiled softly. Let's go. Love, there's more than one way to fly. The cabin door closed behind them. Karen exhaled, thinking she'd handled a minor issue. She didn't know that the man who just stepped off that plane had the power to make the very system she trusted bow its head. Downstairs, in the lounge, David scrolled through his contacts. His tone was calm, no anger, no bitterness. Ava, I need immediate departure. Destination Zurich. Use Carter 1. That short, composed sentence marked the beginning of a response that would shake an entire airline, not through outrage, not through noise, but through the quiet, unshakable force of dignity. When the cabin door closed behind them, it felt like the story was over. But the truth is, sometimes, the doors we walk away from are the very ones where something much bigger begins, something no one, not even they could have seen coming. David and Monica were escorted to the airline's customer service area. The staff wore polite smiles, but their eyes avoided contact. No one said it out loud, but both of them knew they'd just been labeled a security issue, even though they hadn't raised their voices once. Gary Finch, the shift manager, held his tablet like a shield. His voice was flat, cold, rehearsed as if he were reading a script. There was a system error, but we can't allow you back on board for safety reasons. We can rebook you on tomorrow's flight premium economy. Of course, and offer you meal vouchers. Monica looked up, her voice steady, but her eyes held a quiet wound. Safety reasons. How does a valid ticket become a safety issue? Gary didn't answer directly. He just repeated, "That was the purser's decision. I'm simply following procedure." Procedure. A harmless word until it becomes a wall between people and justice. David didn't argue. He just looked around the glowing screens, the polished airline logos, the endless flow of passengers moving on. The world kept turning, as if what had just happened to them was nothing more than a speck of dust in a massive, well-oiled machine. He turned to Monica and said quietly, "Let's go. Don't waste breath on those who don't want to understand." They left the counter, walking slowly past curious eyes and hushed whispers. A few people recognized them. David's face had been on the cover of Aerospace Today last year, and Monica had been interviewed by CNN. But no one spoke. No one wanted to get involved. At the lounge, Monica sank into a leather chair, silent. The cold white light above reflected in her eyes the eyes of someone who'd faced bias before, but never such open humiliation. "You know what hurts most," she said softly. "It's not that they kicked us off. It's that they believed they had the right to, without feeling even a little bit guilty." David didn't respond. He pulled out his phone and replayed the video he'd recorded in the cabin, Karen stepping forward, Chad pointing, the sharp voice saying, "That's my seat," all of it on record. But instead of anger, he exhaled slowly. "If I'd fought back in that moment, they'd call us disruptive. If I stayed silent, they'd think we were weak. But you know something." He looked at the glowing screen, the reflection of light in his eyes sharp as steel. Sometimes, the strongest act of resistance is refusing to lose your calm. Monica pressed her lips together and nodded. That line sounded like something he'd said before, a reminder that they'd both survived subtler, longer, and far more painful battles. But this time, there was something different in David's eyes, a quiet calculation that made her uneasy. Back on the plane, Karen Miller was filing her report to senior management. She felt uneasy, not exactly guilty, but with that vague discomfort that comes when you sense you might have crossed a line you can't take back. Chad Baxter, the drunken passenger, had slumped into seat 1A, ordering another glass of champagne, bragging to the person next to him, "I know people in management. Don't worry, I fly this route all the time." Karen didn't care. In her mind, the issue was handled. But an hour later, just as the plane prepared for taxi, the airline's internal communications team received an alert video of an incident in first class. Flight AX-71 is spreading rapidly through internal channels. Karen heard it over her headset, and her heart dropped. She didn't know the footage came from the phone of the man she'd just forced off the aircraft, down below. David stepped out of the lounge, phone pressed to his ear. "Eva, it's me. Prepare. Carter 1, we're flying to Zurich. I'll send the flight plan in 30 minutes. A calm, professional female voice responded. "Understood, power." "Sir, engines will be powered up in 10. Monica turned to him. Startled, "David, what are you doing?" He smiled, that steady kind of smile that somehow makes you feel both reassured and uneasy. "Nothing. We're just going to fly. Our own way." He didn't need to say more. There was no anger in his tone, only control. To David, true power never came from shouting. It came from making others see their own mistakes through your actions, not your rage. A young airline employee approached them, holding the luggage they'd checked earlier. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I'm really sorry about what happened. I know you weren't at fault. It's just—" He hesitated, then bowed his head. David placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "It's okay. You're just doing your job. But remember, by the book doesn't always mean right." The young man froze, a sentence he would remember for years. On the departure board. Flight AX719. New York to Zurich blinked, departing on time. Everything looked normal. But hours later, when Carter 1 rolled down the runway, the world would realize that morning at Kennedy Airport was anything but normal. David looked out through the glass, his eyes calm, steady, the kind of gaze that holds more depth than anger, because he knew when dignity is violated, it becomes the most powerful fuel there is. He took Monica's hand and said quietly, "You know, they think they just kicked an engineer out of first class. But really, they just walked away from a lesson they could have learned the easy way." The watch on his wrist caught the morning light, a glint of cold metal, sharp as conviction. And in that reflection, you could almost see the beginning of justice, quietly, starting to move. If life were a chessboard, then sometimes the most dangerous move doesn't come from the powerful, but from those afraid of losing control. That morning at Kennedy Airport, fear not logic turned a simple misunderstanding into a security incident that an entire system would soon pay for. After refusing the downgrade to lower-class seats, David Carter and Monica stood near the service counter, waiting patiently for the airline to process their complaint. They didn't yell. They didn't post angry videos online. They didn't demand public sympathy. David made just one simple request: "I'd like to speak with your technical or check-in operations team." Clearly, this is a seat assignment error. It was a reasonable technical request, the kind you'd expect from an engineer. He believed in systems, in data, in procedure. But the way he spoke, calm, firm, eyes locked in steady contact, made Karen Miller, the chief flight attendant, feel something else entirely. Like she was being challenged. To her, it wasn't a rational passenger asking for clarity. It was a black man demanding something she didn't think he had the right to ask for. Her voice dropped to a whisper over the radio, sharp and precise as a blade. "Operations. I need support. Passenger is showing signs of non-compliance. Potential security risk." And from that moment, the dominoes began to fall. Minutes later, Gary Finch returned, this time with 2 security officers. They didn't ask questions. They didn't listen. They simply looked at David with that all-too-familiar expression, the look of default suspicion. One of the officers spoke bluntly. "Sir, we've received a report that you are being disruptive. Please cooperate while we verify your information." David didn't move. His hands stayed relaxed at his sides. His voice was low. "Even. I haven't been disruptive. I'm simply trying to verify a system error. I'm sure no one here wants to mistake that for a security threat. But it didn't matter. Once you've been labeled a security risk, truth no longer matters. Only fear does." Monica stood by, gripping the strap of her handbag. Part of her wanted to shout, to defend her husband, but she knew he wouldn't want that. He told her once, "If we shout, they won't hear the truth, only the noise." Karen crossed her arms. cold eyes fixed on David. She felt secure, wrapped in her uniform and protocol, believing everyone would take her side, as they always do with the one holding the authority badge. But what she didn't know was that David had already started recording not to expose, but to preserve. It was habit. The quiet instinct of a man who'd seen justice twisted too many times by the story told by those in power. The scene wasn't loud. No shouting, no handcuffs, no struggle. But it was the stillness that unsettled everyone the way David stood there, perfectly composed, his words measured precise, like a man leading a boardroom meeting, not defending himself against accusation. The guards hesitated. They were waiting for a flash of anger, a reason to control the situation. But the man in front of them offered none, just calm and unshakable dignity. Finally, Gary broke the silence, his voice bureaucratic, detached. Given the flight schedule, we'll have to deny boarding for the Carters. The airline will issue a refund and offer rebooking. Please vacate the boarding area. David nodded. He didn't argue. He turned to Karen and spoke quietly, his tone soft, but cutting through the air like glass. You just created a precedent. Your airline will have to rewrite its entire procedure over. Karen's lips twitched, part confusion, part defiance. I followed protocol. You can file a complaint later. David smiled faintly. Oh, I'll do more than that. There was no threat in his voice. It sounded more like a line of code calm, clean, inevitable. Monica knew immediately he meant every word. As they passed through security, a young female staffer hurried up, trembling. I'm sorry. I know this isn't right. But if we speak up here, they mark us as non-compliant employees. David gave her a gentle smile. You don't have to say anything. Just remember how this feels. Next time someone's treated unfairly, don't stay silent. Her eyes filled with tears. Maybe right there. His kindness planted something small, the seed of change, in just one person's heart. Outside, Monica asked softly. Are you angry? David paused, thinking for a moment, then answered in a voice barely above a breath. No. Anger is a gift we give to those who don't deserve it. I'm not angry, just disappointed. Not at them, but at a system that still lets people believe they're above others because of their skin color. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. His words carried the quiet weight of someone who's lived this before and still chose grace over rage. Monica took his hand. In her eyes was pure trust. She knew he wouldn't let this slide, but he'd never choose the noisy path. Hours later, seated in the private aviation terminal, David opened his laptop. He logged into the Air Traffic Coordination Network, a system accessible only to senior engineers like him. On the screen appeared AX-715, ready for departure, runway 4L. David smiled faintly. If they think we're just passengers, he said quietly, maybe they should check their runway before takeoff. Monica looked at him, realizing the truth the fight had just begun. Not with fists, not with fury, but with intelligence and justice. Later that day, in Stellar Airlux's internal report, a single line was entered: minor incident. Passenger Carter denied boarding for security reasons. No damage reported. What they didn't know was that within hours, that minor incident would explode into the biggest crisis in the airline's history, and the name Carter would be on headlines around the world. Sometimes, life doesn't need villains to create injustice, just a few people who follow procedure without compassion. And that morning, at Kennedy Airport, it all played out perfectly precise, efficient, and as cold as a machine. When David Carter asked to check the airline system, He had no idea that a simple, rational request would summon Gary Finch, the flight supervisor, accompanied by 2 security officers. They moved through the first-class cabin with tense faces as if they were about to confront a threat. Not 2 passengers in suits. Standing beside them, Karen Miller, the chief flight attendant, spoke softly but clearly. "That's them, the couple in 1A and 1B. They refuse to move and are showing signs of noncompliance." The word noncompliance dropped like a stamp on paper. No one questioned it. No one verified it. And just like that, 2 ordinary passengers became a case. Gary turned to David. "Sir, we've received a report that you're obstructing the boarding process. Please cooperate. We're ready for departure." David looked at him, not angry, not afraid, just the calm recognition of a man who knows reason has already left the room. "I haven't obstructed anyone. I only asked that the airline verify its seat data. The flight attendant asked us to move without any proof of a booking error. All I did was ask why Gary avoided his eyes." He glanced at his watch, his tone flattening into the one David had heard 100 times before, the voice of authority that confuses control for correctness. "I understand, sir, but we're out of time. For the sake of the flight schedule, I'm asking you to leave your seats. We'll resolve this after takeoff. For the sake of the flight schedule." 4 words that sounded reasonable and merciless. They turned a matter of dignity into a logistical problem. Monica placed her hand gently on her husband's shoulder. She could feel the small wave rising in him. Not anger, but deep disappointment. "Don't let them pull you down to their level," she whispered. David nodded. He turned back to Gary, his voice low but sharp with clarity. "All right. But just know this: when you choose to ignore what's wrong, you become part of it." Gary didn't respond. He just motioned to the security officers waiting by the door. No one raised their voice. No one laid a hand. But the humiliation lived in the glances and the quiet steps of people convinced they were just doing their job. As David and Monica stood up, the first-class cabin fell silent. Around them sat executives, politicians, and a few recognizable faces. None of them looked up. A few bowed their heads. Others buried their attention in their phones. They all knew what was happening was wrong, but silence felt safer. Karen folded her arms, expression blank, watching them go. In her mind, she had maintained order. But somewhere, deep beneath that armor of confidence, a faint crack began to echo the first fracture in her certainty. At the cabin door, before stepping out, David turned back. His voice was calm, low, but each word carried weight. "Ms. Miller," he said, "one day you'll understand that the most dangerous thing isn't when people make mistakes. It's when they start believing they can't." No one replied. The words hung in the air between the soft gold cabin lights and the hum of engines preparing for takeoff. He looked at Monica and nodded. "Let's go." "Love, they have a flight to catch, and we have somewhere higher to be." They left the plane in silence. The 2 officers followed behind, saying nothing. The door closed with a metallic click, and only then did Karen realize her heart was racing. Gary turned to her. "Note it. Passenger Carter refused to comply. Removed per security request. File the report." Karen nodded, her hand trembling slightly. She wrote without looking up. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she'd just crossed an invisible line, the one that separates doing your job from doing what's right. But she comforted herself with a thought that has excused countless wrongs throughout history. I had no choice. That phrase, "I had no choice," has always been the shield of those too afraid to face the cost of conscience. Downstairs, David and Monica sat in a private area. A young employee approached, apologetic, offering meal vouchers. Monica gently declined. David thanked him, then unlocked his phone. He sent a single message to Eva Rasta, captain of the Carter 1 change of plan. Departing in 2 hours. Zurich. Eva replied instantly. Copy that, sir. Engines will be ready. Monica looked at him. Are you going to sue them? David smiled, calm, unhurried. No, I don't need noise. I just want them to understand that every unjust decision has a price, and sometimes that price is paid in silence. There was no revenge in his tone, only awareness, the kind that comes from someone who's been hurt many times and still chooses dignity over rage. On flight AX715, Karen sat alone in the crew area, staring out the window as the plane rolled toward the runway. She told herself, it's over. But across the airfield, a Gulfstream G700 Carter 1 was powering up its engines. 2 aircraft, departing the same airport, bound for Zurich. But only one would land with its honor intact. And just a few hours later, when the video of that minor incident began to spread, the whole world would discover that the man removed from seat 1A that morning was the very same man who owned the private jet now blocking the runway they had just taken off from. The airport buzzed as if nothing had happened. But sometimes, one person's silence can echo louder than the roar of jet engines. After being forced off the plane for flight schedule reasons, David Carter and Monica sat quietly in the lounge. The midday sun cut through the thick airport glass, casting calm, golden lines across their faces, too calm, almost unnaturally so. For the first 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. Only the rhythmic voice from the PA system and the soft roll of luggage wheels filled the air. Monica looked at her husband. He was composed, too composed. It wasn't anger she saw. It was focus. Cold, precise focus. What are you thinking? She asked softly. David smiled faintly, eyes never leaving his phone. I'm reviewing the video. We'll need it, but not today. On screen. The footage played back clearly, every look, every word. Karen Miller's icy tone, Gary Finch's avoidance, and Chad Baxter's drunken arrogance. No shouting, no chaos. Just the quiet truth that those in uniform were the ones in the wrong. Monica sighed. If this goes public, they'll panic. But are you sure it's wise to release it now? David shook his head. Not yet. Everything only has value when it happens at the right moment. He said it like an engineer, measured, analytical, as if he were discussing a system design, not a personal humiliation. But in his eyes, there was a spark, the light of a man who just decided to fight back, not with noise, but with intelligence. A young airport employee approached, 2 cups of coffee trembling slightly in his hands. Mrs. and Mrs. Carter, I'm truly sorry about what happened. I know they were wrong, but we couldn't say anything. David accepted the coffee with a small nod. Don't worry. In a system run by fear, silence is a natural reflex. Just remember this one day. When you're in a position to change something, don't stay silent. The young man bowed his head, eyes red. For the first time in his career, he felt ashamed for having followed procedure. David opened his laptop and logged into the Internal Aviation Network, a system he still had access to from his years as a senior aerospace consultant. Within seconds, a list of international flights appeared, each queued for departure on runway 4L. Among them, AX715, the stellar Airlux flight that had thrown him off. Beside him, Monica gazed out the window. Jets lined up like silver arrows under the sun, their reflections glinting across the tarmac. What are you doing, David? She asked quietly. He smiled, his voice calm, almost amused. Nothing. I just want them to remember that silence doesn't always mean weakness. It wasn't revenge he sought. It was reflection. He wasn't trying to hurt them. He wanted them to see themselves clearly, in the mirror of their own arrogance. He made a call. "Eva, it's me. Prepare for Zurich. We're taking off in 45 minutes. And don't request a slot. I'll handle that." On the other end, Captain Eva Rasta, pilot of the Carter 1, replied in her steady, composed voice. "Copy that, Mr. Carter. The aircraft is ready." Monica chuckled softly. "They kicked us out of seat 1A, but they don't know we have an entire jet to ourselves." David looked at her, his smile faint, tinged with melancholy. Money doesn't make you better than anyone. It just gives you the freedom to choose how you respond. And I choose silence, the kind that has purpose. As they walked toward the private terminal, a few commercial passengers recognized them. An older man in a navy suit stood and said quietly, "I saw what happened. I just want you to know, I respect how you handled it. At my age, I've learned sometimes saying nothing is the loudest answer." David shook his hand and nodded. Monica smiled a small, calm smile. Despite the humiliation, they had held on to the one thing that truly mattered, their dignity. The Carter won a sleek, silver-gray Gulfstream G700 with the subtle insignia of a soaring bird waited in the private hangar. Ground crew bowed as the couple ascended the steps. Through the glass, Monica spotted the distant AX-715 taxiing toward the same runway, the very flight that had expelled them. "It's strange," she murmured. "They're flying the same route, but somehow you're the one in control." David smiled. "Not because I crave power, but because I refuse to let ignorance steer the people who know they're right." He settled into the soft leather seat, opened his laptop, and typed a short technical command into the flight coordination system, something perfectly legal, but enough to make stellar airlucks pause and pay attention for a few hours. As the engines hummed to life, Monica turned to him. "Do you ever regret choosing calm instead of fighting back?" David looked out the window, voice steady, eyes unwavering. Anger makes people feel powerful. For 5 minutes, calm makes people remember you for the rest of their lives. She took his hand, rested her head on his shoulder. The Carter 1 accelerated, wings unfolding against the orange glow of the afternoon sun. In the distance, Runway. 4L shimmered a stretch of concrete where, minutes later, something unexpected would bring the entire airport to a standstill. But inside that quiet cabin, there was no talk of revenge, only silence, purposeful, deliberate silence. Because for David, this was never about a seat in first class. It was about a principle that dignity can't be taken away, only surrendered if you allow it. And sometimes, the quiet resolve of the underestimated is the very thing that makes an entire system bow its head. As the Carter 1 lifted off the runway, the late afternoon light slanted across the horizon like a quiet farewell. Inside the private jet, David Carter said nothing. He stared out the window, watching clouds drift by in slow motion, thick, white layers moving peacefully, as if they had nothing to do with what had just happened down below. But inside him, everything was in motion, silent, precise, like the gears of a machine that had just come alive. Beside him, Monica sat quietly, studying his face. She knew that look, the look of a man calculating his next move, not out of vengeance, but to reclaim justice in a way no one would see coming. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. David didn't turn his head. His voice was low, steady. "I'm thinking, maybe they haven't learned their lesson yet, and maybe I can help them learn." Monica gave a faint, sorrowful smile. "You're as calm as ever. I can't tell whether I should admire you or worry about you." David reached for her hand. "Don't worry. I won't let anger lead the way. But I also won't let this insult go to waste." Before takeoff, they had stopped by the Stellar Airlux service counter. A nervous young clerk had delivered the message with forced politeness. "I'm sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Your flight today is full. We can rebook you for tomorrow morning premium economy with a hotel voucher near the airport." The words were gentle, but they cut just as deep. It wasn't about a seat. It was about being dismissed coldly, mechanically, by a system that confuses procedure for justice. David had simply nodded. He understood now sometimes a system doesn't need cruelty to be cruel. All it takes is indifference. As the jet climbed away from New York, David opened his laptop. A series of technical dashboards filled the screen: radar data, flight timelines, European air routes. He wasn't hacking. He didn't need to. Every access he used was legitimate, a privilege from his former role as a senior technical advisor to an international aerospace firm. One entry caught his eye: AX 715 runway, 4L estimated takeoff, 5:24 p.m. He typed a short line of code, then leaned back in his seat. Nothing illegal, nothing reckless, just a small, perfectly valid safety condition that required an additional 15-minute inspection before the next takeoff from that same runway. A simple act, harmless, but enough to trigger a ripple effect across the system. "Remember when you worked for the aircraft manufacturer?" Monica asked. David nodded. "You used to say a single miscalculation can stop an entire system." He smiled. "Exactly. And today, that miscalculation isn't in the engines. It's in how people treat each other." Monica's heart swelled with conflicting feelings. She loved his composure and feared it, because she knew that behind his quiet eyes was steel. "You're not putting anyone in danger, are you?" "No," he said calmly. "I'm just making sure they pause long enough to see themselves in the mirror." That answer eased her shoulders. In that moment, she realized this wasn't about revenge. It was about reminding people what dignity looks like. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a notification appeared on David's phone. "Runway 4L flight delay chain. 27 minutes delay due to safety check." He smiled faintly, without pride or triumph. It was the smile of someone who understood that every action leaves a trace. He saved the official report and attached it to the video he'd recorded earlier, a precise, quiet archive of everything that had happened in that first-class cabin. Not for publicity, for purpose. Monica placed her hand on his shoulder. "I just worry people might misunderstand. You think you're trying to get even?" David shook his head. "Let them think what they want. I'm not out for payback. I'm doing what's right. Justice doesn't always need the law. Sometimes it just needs one person who refuses to bow." The words lingered in the air. The steady hum of the engines filled the silence, and between them pulsed something stronger, the rhythm of resolve. Hours later, David's phone vibrated. The caller ID flashed Margaret Holloway, CEO, Stellar Airlux. He didn't answer. He just looked at the screen, then turned the phone face down. "You know her?" Monica asked. "Yes," he said. "She used to be a partner on the navigation project. She's probably heard that Runway 4L was shut down for an emergency inspection. It'll take them hours to figure out what really happened." Monica's eyes softened, a mix of pride and ache. "You don't need to do this to prove anything." David smiled gently. "This isn't about proving. It's about reminding that a person's dignity can't be downgraded like a ticket." When the Carter 1 landed in Zurich, Night had fallen. Cool air brushed across the tarmac, carrying the faint metallic scent of jet fuel. Monica stepped down first, then turned to look back. David stood at the top of the stairway, wearing a black coat, the warm yellow lights reflecting across half his face. In that moment, she saw it clearly. The man who had been pulled from seat 1A was no longer a victim. He was the one moving the pieces on the board, with calm precision, with a mind no one could dismiss. For others, being removed from a seat would be nothing but humiliation. But for David Carter, it was ignition a spark that turned shame into momentum. And what made his story different wasn't revenge, but restraint. He gave justice a face of compassion. No shouting, no bitterness, just clarity and endurance. Some people don't need to raise their voice to be heard. They just stay silent long enough, and the world eventually turns to ask, who is he? When the Carter One touched down in Zurich under the midnight sky, the airport was nearly empty. Runway lights shimmered against the silver skin of the Gulf Stream, G700 making it look like a glowing arrow cutting through the dark. David Carter descended first, no escort, no entourage. Hours earlier, he was the man pulled from a first-class seat. Now, every step he took carried weight. Beside him, Monica walked quietly. The night wind lifted her hair, and in her eyes shone something soft, yet proud. "You know," David said in his low, steady voice, "people think power means being able to command others. But to me, real power is making others stop and look at themselves." She nodded, gripping his hand a little tighter. They didn't need to say anything more. Both knew the game had just shifted to a new board. The next morning, in his private office, overlooking Zurich city center, David opened his laptop. The screen lit up with the interface of the International Air Traffic Network, a system only a handful of top engineers could access. He zoomed in on Kennedy Airport, the place where it all began. A tiny dot moved across the screen. IXR-15, the Stellar Airlux flight, still taxiing along runway 4L. "They're still flying like nothing ever happened," Monica murmured. David smiled faintly, not bitterly, but knowingly. "That's what I love about people who think they're always right. They never stop to look around." He switched to data analysis mode, radar signals, route vectors, airspeed telemetry, all legitimate, all transparent. The only difference was, he knew how to read them in ways others couldn't. He pressed a button. "Eva, we have a small change in the plan." "Your orders." "Mr. Carter." "Yes." "Prepare for takeoff from Zurich in 2 hours. We'll proceed to Geneva as scheduled, but I need the Carter One system to send a test ping to New York Control runway 4L. Wait 3 minutes for a response." "Copy that." "Sir, I'll report back once it's done." Eva Rasta, captain of the Carter One, didn't ask why. She knew her employer well when he gave an order. It wasn't to show off. It was to teach someone a lesson they would never forget. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in the Stellar Airlux Operations Office, a mild system alert appeared on their monitors. Foreign jet testing frequency on runway 4L. Temporary hold required. A small line of text. But it was enough to make the dispatch team pause every pending takeoff. When they traced the source of the signal, they found the name Carter Aviation Group, the same aerospace firm Stellar was currently partnering with on their new radar technology. The name Carter flashed on their screens, and within minutes, CEO Margaret Holloway was on the phone with Flight Supervisor Gary Finch. Her voice was cold, sharp, and direct. "Gary, what exactly happened with David Carter yesterday in the control room?" Whispers spread quickly. Carter, wait. He's the guy who designed the routing software we use. That can't be right. They said he was just a passenger who got bumped. And just like that, what Stellar had labeled a small incident had become a quiet earthquake. Back in Zurich, David worked in silence. He didn't need to check the news. He already knew every ripple his actions would cause. Monica looked over and smiled softly. You're not going to tell them who you are. He lifted his eyes, kind, but firm. No, they'll find out on their own. And when they do, what they'll remember isn't how much power I have, but how terribly they treated someone they thought was nobody. Monica smiled sadly, because she understood this was the strength of the man she loved. He didn't use power to prove himself. He used it to make others realize the cost of losing their humanity. 3 hours later, an internal report appeared at Stellar Headquarters Radar Anomaly, Runway 4L, source linked to Carter Aviation. Verification required. Moments later, CEO Margaret Holloway called the Zurich office, only to hear a calm reply. Mr. Carter isn't available at the moment. He's currently in flight to Geneva. And in that moment, Margaret saw the whole picture. The man her staff had thrown off flight AX-715 wasn't just a customer. He was the architect of the very system her company relied on to stay in the air. As the Carter 1 took off again, Monica gazed out the window. The sunset painted the clouds in crimson gold. Do you regret not reacting right then? She asked quietly. David shook his head, smiling warmly. No. People only learn when they have to ask themselves why they were wrong. I just gave them that chance. She smiled back, resting her head on his shoulder. Outside, the sky was calm, but somewhere across the ocean, an entire airline was being forced to look at itself. In life, some moments don't need shouting or fists on the table. Sometimes, all it takes is a single name appearing at the right time, a quiet action done the right way, and the whole system stops to listen. David Carter never sought victory. He sought clarity. To remind the world, no one has the right to look down on another person just because they fail to recognize their worth. And that's how he turned the game upside down, not with power, but with calm and dignity. Some lessons can't be taught in words. They have to be felt in the stillness that follows. And that morning, the sky above New York stopped moving because of one man who had once been dragged out of his first-class seat. After leaving Zurich, David Carter said very little. He and Monica sat quietly inside the cabin of the Carter 1, watching sunlight ripple across the Atlantic Ocean, bright streaks gliding over the water like moving mirrors. Monica turned to him softly. Are you ready for Geneva? David smiled faintly, his voice calm, deliberate. Yes. But before that flight, there's one small thing I need to do. No one will get hurt. I just want them to remember. The words were gentle, but beneath them lay the weight of absolute intent. He opened his tablet, connecting to the private flight operations network. Eva Rasta, captain of the Carter 1, appeared on screen, her voice crisp, professional. Good morning, Mr. Carter. All set. Route to Geneva approved. Departure runway 4L. Same as Stellar Airlux. David nodded slowly. A moment of silence passed before he spoke. Evenly, Eva. I want us to depart right after Stellar's AX-715. Let them go first, and when they lift off, line up on the same runway and hold position. If control asks, report a hydraulic issue. Eva didn't question him. She simply replied steady, composed, understanding more than words could say copy that. Sir. The Carter 1 taxied out from its hangar. Blending into the Monday morning flow of traffic, just another sleek private jet in the queue, its true ownership known to almost no one. Ahead, the stellar Airlux. A350 flight AX715 moved into position on runway 4L in the cockpit. Eva watched it through the glass. Next to her, David sat in the co-pilot seat, headset on, silent. They're requesting takeoff clearance. Eva noted. David nodded once. Let them fly. When they're airborne, wait 30 seconds, then move into position. Eva followed his order to the second. The tower light turned green. XC-115 roared forward, engine screaming as it lifted gracefully into the morning sky. Seconds later, the radio crackled. Carter 1. You're cleared for takeoff. Runway. 4L is open. Eva didn't respond immediately. She glanced at David. He gave a slow nod. Carter 1. Line up and wait. We've got a hydraulic warning. Checking system pressure. The tower went silent. A beat passed confusion in the air. Then, the controller's voice returned. Now cautious. Copy that. Carter 1. Holding runway 4L. Confirm, are you declaring emergency negative? Eva replied calmly. Just a precaution. Possible hydraulic anomaly. We'll report in 3. And with that, one of the busiest international runways in the world stopped cold. Every takeoff behind them froze. Warning lights blinked across the tarmac. Emergency vehicles rolled out, ready for a problem that didn't exist. For 15 minutes. New York's morning air traffic fell into controlled chaos. Inside the cockpit, David sat quietly, eyes fixed on the window watching the line of commercial jets stretching behind them, including several with the stellar Airlux logo. It was poetic. They had once thrown him off their plane for the sake of schedule. Now, their planes were grounded for the sake of his silence. From the cabin, Monica leaned forward. David, what exactly are you teaching them? He answered slowly, his voice like a calm tide. That speed isn't as important as attitude, and that sometimes a runway like life has to stop so we can remember who we've wronged. For 15 long minutes, Kennedy Airport operated in a semi-emergency state. Tower voices looped through the radio. Carter 1, confirmed system status, still diagnosing, pressure unstable, holding position. Eva's replies were flawless, professional, precise, within every regulation. To the system, this was a legitimate safety protocol. No one could accuse them of anything. Yet minute by minute, dozens of flights were delayed. International schedules had to be rewritten. And far above all of it, a single man sat in silence, watching order unravel just enough for the world to notice. In Stellar's operations office, panic began to ripple. Carter 1 is blocking runway. 4L wait. That's Carter Aviation Group. David Carter, that's him. The same passenger we kicked off AX715. The room fell still. CEO Margaret Holloway froze at her desk. She didn't need a report to understand. This wasn't an accident. It was an answer. Out on the runway, the Carter 1 stood silent, engines humming low. David removed his headset, gazing through the glass, his face calm, almost solemn. Eva, he said quietly, we'll move once the tower confirms everything's clear. But don't rush. Give them time to think. Understood. Sir? Minutes later, the all-clear came. Carter 1, you're good to go. Runway 4L is clear. Copy that. Eva replied. Carter 1 departing. The jet accelerated, cutting through the morning air like a silver blade, leaving behind a runway in disarray, an airline in turmoil, and 1,000 unspoken realizations. High above the clouds, Monica watched him. There was no gloating in his expression, only peace. Aren't you afraid they'll think this was revenge? She asked. David looked out toward the horizon, voice quiet. If they do, that's fine. Because sometimes people only learn humility when they come face to face with their own shame. She smiled gently, taking his hand. You're not retaliating, David. You're teaching them how to stop. He smiled back. Outside, sunlight pierced through thin layers of cloud, turning the sky into molten gold. And in that light, David whispered almost to himself, not every noise is power. Sometimes, the right silence can stop the sky itself. That was the true turning point when the man who was dragged from his seat didn't humiliate anyone to reclaim his dignity, but simply made the world realize the value of respect. The sky was silent after the Carter 1 disappeared into the clouds, but on the ground, everything was unraveling as if someone had dropped a single pebble into a glass-still lake, and the ripples refused to fade. Within minutes of Eva Rasta's calm report temporary hydraulic loss, Runway 4L at Kennedy Airport was officially shut down. By regulation, every departure scheduled for that runway was halted until a full safety inspection could be completed. No one had imagined that a simple phrase, "We have a problem," could paralyze the entire transatlantic flight network. On the operations screen, dozens of aircraft icons blinked in yellow, each one a delayed commercial flight, stacked in lines stretching for hours. And at the center of it all, the silver jet of the Carter 1 sat motionless on the runway, like a living monument to stillness inside one of the most powerful systems on Earth. Outside, fire trucks and maintenance crews surrounded the aircraft, moving by the book, executing procedures with quiet precision. No shouting, no panic, but that silence, that perfect procedural silence, was exactly what David Carter wanted the world to see: a massive, confident system forced to stop by the calm of the man it once dismissed. Inside the central control tower, the tension was electric. A young technician stammered, "Why Carter 1 that's owned by Carter Aviation Group?" "They maintain our monitoring software," another voice answered, trembling. "And its owner is David Carter, the man we just forced off flight. AX 715 this morning." The room went quiet. No one dared use the phrase "minor incident" again. 45 floors above Midtown Manhattan, Margaret Holloway, CEO of Stellar Airlux, was drowning in urgent calls. The press had caught the scent. A few aviation reporters tweeted unconfirmed runway 4L temporarily closed after private jet. Carter 1, owned by Carter Aviation Group, reported a technical issue. Coincidence? The jet belongs to engineer David Carter, a former Stellar collaborator. Those brief lines spread like sparks on dry grass. Within an hour, social media was ablaze. The name David Carter appeared thousands of times. People remembered him from the International Aviation Conference in Geneva, the man honored for contributions to global flight safety. Then came the tweet that changed everything. Prominent attorney Sarah Jenkins, a passenger on AX 715, wrote, "I witnessed it. A black couple removed from first class despite valid tickets. Staff dismissed their protests, calling it a security issue. Now the runway's closed because of that man's jet. Maybe justice knows how to keep time." The post went viral. Within hours, Carter incident was trending in the top 3 nationwide. The Atlantic, New York Times, NBC News all joined the chase. In a quiet apartment overlooking Lake Geneva, David Carter sat by the window, steam rising from his cup of tea. Across from him, Monica scrolled through the headlines, a mixture of awe and worry in her eyes. "They're all talking about you. David, the world's taking our side. But you might have just brought Stellar to its knees. David's voice was calm, almost tender. "I didn't bring them down, Monica. Their arrogance did. I only held up the mirror. Inside Stellar's headquarters, the crisis spread faster than a virus. Supervisor Gary Finch suspended. Chief Flight Attendant Karen Miller summoned for questioning over discriminatory conduct. New video clips began to surface. Karen's cold eyes, Gary's condescending tone, David's quiet composure amid the humiliation. Each frame was a verdict. At Kennedy Airport, reporters swarmed the tarmac, filming the grounded silver jet as it was towed away. That evening, a CBS anchor remarked, "The image of the small Carter 1, surrounded by emergency vehicles, has become a symbol not of failure, but of a necessary pause for an industry that prides itself on speed, yet forgot the importance of respect." Viewers didn't see an accident anymore. They saw balance restore to a system forced to slow down long enough to recognize its own reflection. Monica set her phone down gently. "You made the whole world stop, David, and you never said a word." He smiled, eyes deep and steady. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than outrage. I didn't need to shout for justice. I just made them feel what injustice sounds like when there are no words left." That night, Stellar Airlux's stock plunged 18%. Investors panicked. A rush statement went out. "We are investigating the incident involving passenger David Carter and sincerely apologize for any inconvenience." But it was far too late. The videos had spoken for themselves. People no longer wanted apologies. They wanted change. David set his cup down, eyes on the quiet Geneva skyline. "I never wanted to destroy them, Monica," he said. "I just wanted them to understand every act of disrespect has a cost. And sometimes that cost is silence that makes the whole world listen." Monica squeezed his hand, her voice a whisper. "I think they'll never forget today." He nodded. "Good. Some mistakes should only happen once in a lifetime." That day, the entire American aviation industry had to look inward. One runway closed, one airline faltered, and one man through calm, patience, and dignity taught them a lesson no university could teach. When you look down on someone because you think they have no power, be careful. They might be the very person who keeps your sky from falling. Some fires don't need fuel to burn only a truth that's been buried too long, and one person brave enough to speak what they've seen. The morning after the Runway 4L shutdown, when the world was still buzzing about the delays, a post appeared online. The author Sarah Jenkins, a respected aviation attorney and one of the passengers on AX715 the previous morning. The first line was chilling in its simplicity. "I witnessed the rawest act of discrimination in 20 years of practice, and I will not stay silent." Beneath it, Sarah described every detail how Karen Miller, the lead attendant, told David Carter, "This seat isn't for you." How Gary Finch, the supervisor, ignored every request to verify the tickets and forced the couple off the plane for security reasons. Attached were two photos, one of Karen and Gary standing at the first-class door, and another David and Monica walking away quietly, their faces calm, their eyes carrying something deeper than anger. Sarah wrote, "I don't know who they are, but I know this is how injustice survives, wrapped in procedure, and justified by a polite smile." The post spread like wildfire. Within 2 hours, it had been shared over 300,000 times. People weren't just outraged, they were moved. A comment beneath it read, "If it were me, I'd have shouted. But that man, he stayed silent, and somehow, that silence shamed us all." Meanwhile, investigative reporters began digging through private jet registries. What they found stopped them. Cold Carter. 1. The silver jet that had blocked Runway 4L belonged to Carter Aviation Group, a global aerospace conglomerate worth tens of billions. Its founder and CEO, David Carter. Within minutes, the story exploded across the world. CNN broke the headline. Man removed from first class revealed to be billionaire founder of flight automation technology. NBC followed Stellar Airlux faces. Severe racial bias allegations. Passenger David Carter is a global leader in aviation safety. From The Guardian to Le Monde. From BBC to Reuters. His name spread a symbol of intelligence as resistance. Then came the video, leaked by a passenger, uploaded without caption. In the footage, David's voice could be heard clearly, not raised, not trembling. I don't need an apology. I just need respect. Millions watched, and many fell silent, not from rage, but from recognition. A comment read, "We live in a world where you have to be powerful just to demand the dignity that should belong to everyone." At Stellar Airlux headquarters, the crisis deepened. Stock prices plummeted 30% in 2 days. Investors panicked. Insurers threatened to withdraw coverage. And then came the letter from Carter Aviation Group itself. We are reevaluating our technical partnership in light of recent events. Inside the glass conference room, CEO Margaret Holloway watched CNN replay the image of David boarding his jet. She whispered, almost to herself, "We threw out the only man who could have saved us from this fall." But the story had already outgrown Stellar. It became a mirror held up to an entire country. Talk shows filled their nights with debate. Aviation experts, sociologists, and people who had faced similar humiliation took to the airwaves. On Good Morning America, a retired black pilot said this was never about a seat. It's about a system, one that believes power lives in a badge or a uniform, instead of in how we treat one another. Through it all, David said nothing. No interviews, no statements, no lawsuits. He sent one short email to his communications team. "We say nothing. The truth is speaking for us." Monica read the message and nodded quietly. She knew this was no longer their story. It had become a test of conscience, a question for the world. Would people face their own wrongs when the victim had the power to forgive days later? The New York Times ran a front-page headline, "When Silence Speaks Louder. Lessons from the Carter Incident." It ended with a quote from one of David's past keynote speeches. "Intelligence is not a weapon for revenge. It's a light that reveals human behavior. Those who walk in that light will never need to raise their voice." That line spread across the world, shared millions of times, whispered in classrooms, offices, airports, not out of pity, but out of recognition, because everyone, at some point, has known the sting of being unseen, and the quiet wish to be valued for who they truly are. The media named it the runway silence, a moment when the world stopped, not because of noise, but because of dignity. It became more than a story. It became a mirror. And in the center of that global reflection, David Carter remained still the same calm man, as if he had always known that once awakened, justice finds its own way home. That night in Geneva, Monica sat beside him, watching the city lights shimmer on her teacup. "Do you think," she asked softly, "that sometimes silence is the strongest voice of all?" David smiled, gentle as breath. "Not every silence has power, only the kind that's born from conviction, not fear." When the media firestorm erupted, many assumed David Carter would seize the moment to strike back. But he didn't need to, because in the world of those who wield intellect as a weapon, real power lies in knowing when to stay silent and who to let speak. 3 days after the incident, as Stellar Airlux spiraled into crisis. Margaret Holloway, its CEO, sat alone in her glass-walled office. Outside, screens looped the headline, "The Carter Incident, the Culture of Disrespect in Aviation." Every segment was a scalpel cutting into the reputation she had spent 2 decades building. She had never feared a crisis before until she realized the man her company had humiliated was one who could determine whether it would survive. Her phone rang. Her assistant's voice was quiet. "Ma'am, Mr. Carter is on the line. He's ready to speak with you." Margaret inhaled deeply and pressed accept. David's voice came through low, steady, utterly devoid of anger. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway. I think you know why I'm calling." She tried to sound composed. "Mr. Carter, first of all, I want to express my sincerest personal apology. The incident?" He cut her off softly, yet unmistakably, it wasn't an incident. "Mrs. Holloway, it was a symptom of a cultural disease that's been growing longer than that flight lasted." A silence hung between them. Then, quietly, she said, "Mr. Carter, we've suspended everyone involved. I hope we can find a humane solution." David gave a faint smile, not of mockery, but of someone who understood the game too well. "Humane. You call avoiding responsibility. Humane. I think it's time your company stopped treating morality as a PR strategy. This isn't a technical failure, Miss Holloway. It's a cultural one." His tone stayed calm, every word deliberate, as if addressing not a single person, but an entire system. "I don't want money. I don't want contracts or publicity. I want one thing: honesty. Stellar Airlux must publicly admit what happened, name those responsible, and call it what it is: racial bias. Then you will commit to funding a program on equity and respect in the workplace, run by an independent organization of my choosing." Margaret could barely breathe. There was no threat in his tone, yet every sentence carried the weight of a verdict. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, "what you're asking for could devastate us. Our shareholders will revolt. The press will crucify us." David paused. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet enough to chill the air. "You're worried about shareholders. I'm worried about people like my wife who were humiliated, yet chose dignity over outrage. If your company collapses simply because it told the truth, maybe it was never built on integrity at all." She had no reply. Images flooded her mind. Karen Miller's cold stare, Gary Finch's smug posture, the man they had forced to leave his seat in silence, her model employees, her strict adherence to protocol. Now she saw it clearly. It was the protocol that had stripped away their humanity. David's voice softened, but grew heavier. "I'm not seeking revenge, Mrs. Holloway. I'm asking for change. If Stellar truly wants to earn back trust, start by taking responsibility not just to me, but to everyone who's ever been dismissed without a voice." "How do you want us to do that?" she asked, trembling. "Simply," he said, "with your own mouth." A long pause. "I want you to stand before the press yourself. No PR team, no script, just you, and the truth." Margaret's voice broke. "You know that will destroy me, don't you?" David replied gently. "No, Mrs. Holloway, it will save you." When the call ended, she sat motionless for a long time. The office was dark except for the TV replaying the image of Carter 1. A single tear traced her cheek, not from weakness, but from the realization that she had stood on the wrong side of decency for far too long. The next morning, under the white lights of a global press conference, Margaret Holloway stepped to the podium. No script, no PR handlers, just her and the truth. My name is Margaret Holloway, CEO of Stellar Airlux. 3 days ago, our company wronged 2 passengers, David and Monica Carter. We did not simply fail a procedure, we failed humanity. This was not a technical incident. It was a cultural one. The room was silent. We apologized to Mr. and Mrs. Carter, and to everyone who has ever been treated as they were. Stellar will partner with Equity First Alliance to implement mandatory training on equity and unconscious bias. Beginning this month, we are not doing this to salvage our reputation. We are doing it because it is the right thing to do. When she finished, there was no applause from the press, only from a few Stellar employees standing backstage, hands trembling, eyes wet. They knew it wasn't just the company that had been redeemed. It was them, in Geneva. David watched the broadcast on a small hotel screen. Monica sat beside him, their fingers intertwined. "You did it without ever raising your voice," she whispered. David smiled. "No," he said softly. "I just reminded them when respect disappears, no airline can truly fly." And in that moment, David Carter did more than reclaim his dignity. He made an empire kneel before the idea of basic humanity. That was the ultimate leverage, transforming humiliation into a catalyst for awakening a culture. After that press conference, the world seemed to pause for a beat. Not because of the market crash, nor the media storm, but because, for the first time, a major airline had dared to say what most corporations only whisper behind closed doors. We failed not in technology, but in morality. The next morning, Stellar Airlux released its official statement. It didn't sound like any apology the aviation industry had ever heard. No evasive phrasing, no unfortunate incidents, no excuses hidden behind procedures. The opening line read, plain and unflinching, "We were wrong. And we were wrong because we forgot that respect cannot be measured by the price of a ticket." The company publicly named the 2 employees terminated: Karen Miller, chief flight attendant, and Gary Finch, flight supervisor on AX-714. Chad Baxter, the drunken passenger who had sparked the chaos, was permanently banned from all Stellar flights. Inside the company, over 40 mid-level managers were ordered to attend a new mandatory program, unconscious bias and cultural equity training led by the Equity First Alliance, the very organization David Carter had chosen. No one had ever seen a precedent like it. At news desks across the country, reporters called it the first corporate self-confession in commercial aviation history. The Washington Post ran a headline that filled the front page: Stellar bows to the truth when ethics becomes the condition to take off. Across America, the story spread like wildfire. No one was talking about technical failures anymore. They were talking about a culture of respect, about the terrifying calm of David Carter, and most of all, about how one man changed an entire system by refusing to react the way that system expected him to. Meanwhile, in Zurich, David and Monica lived as simply as ever. Each morning, they sat on the hotel balcony, coffee in hand, as church bells echoed faintly from across the lake. On Monica's phone, a headline flashed: Stellar Airlux issues full public statement, stock down 32%. Carter Aviation confirms continuation of technical contracts, with new clauses for personnel policy reform. She skimmed it, then set the phone down gently. "They did the right thing," she murmured. "I think this time, they actually learned something." David nodded, not proud, not triumphant, just calm, almost serene. "I never wanted them to collapse. Monica, I just needed them to stop long enough to see the human being in the mirror." Across the ocean, Captain Eva Rasta, pilot of Carter 1, was running her final checks. On the control panel, a green message glowed. Hydraulic system restored, ready for departure. Eva smiled, pressed the radio, and said, "Control. Carter 1 reports full system restored. Request clearance for takeoff." The controller's reply came with a tone of respect that hadn't been there before Carter 1. "You're cleared. Welcome back to the sky." As the jet rolled forward, the sunlight struck its silver fuselage, shimmering like a mirror. Eva whispered to herself, as if sending a message to her employer half a world away. "All systems restored. Mr. Carter." It sounded technical, but it meant something far greater. Not just the aircraft systems, but the human ones were being restored. Inside Stellar's headquarters, the loudest voices had gone quiet. The most arrogant managers sat in reflection. A young engineer whispered, "I never thought a company could rise again because of an apology." Someone beside him replied, "It wasn't the apology. It was admitting that every system can fail as long as there are humans inside it." And that evening in Washington, a journalist summed it up on the nightly news. 2 hours and 37 minutes of runway shutdown cost the aviation industry millions. But sometimes the price of truth must be paid to remind us that justice can't run on autopilot. In the middle of the media frenzy, countless networks begged for interviews with David Carter. He declined everyone. Instead, he sent a short letter to Aviation World magazine. "I don't wish to be a symbol. I only wish to be treated as an ordinary human being. If this helps anyone realize that true power doesn't lie in where we sit, but in how we act, then everything I went through was worth it." The magazine printed the letter on its cover. Readers wept not out of pity, but out of recognition, because they saw themselves in his words. They felt what he had felt, that the greatest strength is not making others fear you, but making them think. Weeks later, Stellar Airlux launched a full-scale reform program. Every new hire was required to complete a course on passenger respect and human dignity, developed from Carter Aviation's own research. The program's name, The Human Altitude. A new plaque was installed in Stellar's headquarters. It read, "No one stands tall enough to look down on another." In Geneva, one quiet evening, Monica asked softly, "Do you think we've won?" David smiled, eyes on the planes crossing the sunset. "No," he said. "We didn't win. We just help them see that sometimes. Landing right matters more than flying high." The next morning, as Carter 1 took off from Switzerland, no cameras rolled, no hashtags trended, only a clear sky and a long, open runway ahead. David sat beside Monica, his hand resting gently on hers. She looked at him and whispered, "I think we've restored something far more valuable than reputation." He nodded, his smile quiet and true. "Yes," he said, "we've restored faith." 2 hours and 37 minutes of chaos. One public apology. 3 careers ended. One system changed. And above all, the world was reminded that respect is not a privilege to be earned, but a duty to be lived. When the media storm finally passed, most people thought the story of David and Monica Carter had ended with a public apology, a few dismissals, and an airline struggling to rebuild its image. But for them, justice was never about punishment. It was about beginning something better. One crisp autumn morning, inside the Four Seasons Hotel in Geneva, the Carters appeared at their first press conference since the global event known as the Runway Silence. No glamour, no stage production, just a wooden table, a few microphones, and a plain white backdrop bearing a single line. "Dignity is not a privilege, it's a principle." David stepped up to the podium, calm as ever. His voice was warm and steady, free of anger, yet filled with purpose. I'm not here to revisit an old incident. I'm here to talk about an opportunity, the chance to make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else. The room was silent. He paused, looking not at the cameras, but somewhere beyond them. We live in an age where technology can take us to space, but it still hasn't taught us how to treat each other with respect on the ground. Then he turned slightly, toward Monica, her eyes bright, unwavering. And that's why, today, I want to introduce the person who inspired everything I'm about to share. Monica rose, her tone gentle yet firm. When we were pulled from our seats that day, what hurt me most wasn't the humiliation. It was the silence in the eyes of those around us, the silence of people who knew it was wrong, but chose to look away. I thought, if even those with voices stay silent, what hope is there for those who have none? She stopped, then smiled softly, a smile that held both pain and peace. So I decided to turn that silence into action. Monica looked out at the audience. Today, we're officially launching the Carter Foundation for Corporate Responsibility with an initial endowment of $100 million from Carter Aviation Group. The room erupted in flashes and murmurs. Monica remained composed. This foundation will support education, research, and global accountability programs that examine and reform corporate culture. We're not here to destroy organizations. We're here to help them become places where every human being is treated with respect, regardless of race, gender, or background. A journalist raised his hand. Mrs. Carter, why 100 million? And why not sue Stellar for more? Monica smiled. Because we don't want more money, we want more change. The most valuable thing we reclaimed can't be counted in dollars. It's called self-respect. David placed a hand on her shoulder, then spoke with quiet gravity. Injustice must always come with a cost. But that cost shouldn't be destruction, it should be growth. He shared how years ago, as a young engineer, he'd been fired for challenging a white supervisor. Years later, he became the head of the very company that once refused to work with him. I've learned that anger can burn a person down, but intellect can light an entire generation. The room went silent again. A veteran journalist discreetly wiped his eyes, not out of pity, but admiration. Because in David, he saw what grace looks like when it rises from injustice. When the conference ended, David and Monica didn't rush to leave. They stayed to shake hands with everyone, even the reporters who had once questioned their motives. David smiled and said quietly, "Thank you for coming. Every question, even the uncomfortable ones, matters. Because only when we dare to ask, can we dare to change." The next day, the Wall Street Journal ran a headline, "From First Class to a Global Mission, The Journey of David Carter," and the article concluded, "Some people use power for revenge, others use it to heal. David Carter belongs to the latter." In the months that followed, the Carter Foundation expanded to the U.S., Canada, and Europe. It partnered with major corporations to build the Respect Index, a global rating system for workplace culture and inclusivity. Within 6 months, over 120 companies had signed on. In Los Angeles, a young employee shared on TV, "I used to stay quiet when I was discriminated against. But when I learned our company was part of the Carter program, I felt safer. I finally believe someone is actually listening." On a small PBS interview, a host asked David, "What do you think has changed after all this?" He smiled a calm, knowing smile. "Maybe the way people look at each other. Prejudice still exists. Mistakes still happen. But now, people pause even for a second to ask themselves, am I treating this person with respect? And sometimes, that 1 second is enough to change the world a little." The host hesitated, then said quietly, "You know, I used to be a flight attendant. Back then, I judged people by how they looked. Thank you for reminding me I was wrong." David smiled. "If you've realized that, then we're both already flying in the right direction." That night, in their apartment overlooking Lake Geneva, Monica opened her journal and wrote, "Once, we were pulled from our seats. Today, we're helping the world rise a little higher." She set down her pen and looked out the window at the planes gliding through the night sky. There was no anger left, no humiliation, only peace and the quiet certainty that justice, when guided by wisdom and compassion, can become the light that helps the world find its way. 6 months had passed since that press conference in Geneva. The story of David and Monica Carter had faded from the headlines. No more evening news segments. No more waves of hashtags flooding social media. The world, as it always does, had moved on to newer stories. But for the Carters, this silence wasn't forgetfulness. It was peace. That afternoon, at Zurich Airport, they stood together once more in the first-class lounge. No reporters, no camera flashes, only the soft murmur of travelers, the scent of freshly brewed coffee, and the gentle voice of a flight attendant, "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we're honored to welcome you aboard." Monica turned to her husband with a small smile. "You see, this time, no one's asking to check our tickets," David replied, voice warm and measured. "Maybe they've learned something, but more importantly, so have we." He said it quietly, eyes drifting to the window where sunlight shimmered off the silver fuselage of a distant jet. Carter 1, waiting, gleaming, no longer a symbol of power, but of inner control, the calm of a man who'd learned that the greatest strength in the face of injustice is composure. They boarded, seats 1A and 1B, once again, but this time, everything felt different. Their flight attendant was a young woman with brown skin and kind eyes. She placed 2 glasses of orange juice on the table, bowed slightly, and said, "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, thank you. I watched your video. It's the reason I joined this industry, because I wanted to be someone who makes passengers feel respected." Monica smiled and gently took her hand. "Thank you. But if you work with respect in your heart, then you are the one changing this industry." The young woman nodded, eyes glistening, and in that moment, David leaned toward his wife, his look saying without words, "This is what victory truly looks like." As the plane climbed through the clouds, David opened his laptop. On the screen, the first quarterly report from the Carter Foundation. Over 300 companies had joined the program on corporate culture and respect. Several major corporations had voluntarily opened their internal data, revised their HR policies, and reported a 40% reduction in discrimination complaints. No one spoke of the Carter incident anymore. They now called it the Carter effect. Monica rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you think," she whispered, "that if we'd reacted differently that day, if we'd shouted, sued, or fought, any of this would have happened?" David shook his head gently. "No. When you respond with anger, people remember the anger. But when you stay calm, they remember why you were silent." Monica nodded slowly. "The world needs more people who know when to be silent than those who only know how to speak." On the cabin's small screen, a news ticker rolled by Stellar Airlux releases corporate transparency report. Shares rise 18% following reform. Below it, a clip of CEO Margaret Holloway speaking to her employees. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Because of your honesty, we've learned that humility isn't weakness, it's real strength." David watched quietly. no smugness, no pride. Just a faint smile, the kind of smile worn by someone who knows he has reset the course of an entire industry without raising his voice. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, golden sunlight poured through the windows, painting their faces in warm amber. Monica spoke softly. "You know, that day when they dragged us off the plane, I felt ashamed. But now, I feel grateful." David turned to her, surprised. "Grateful?" She nodded. "Yes, because without that moment, we would have never discovered the true power of self-respect." He smiled, taking her hand. "You're right. Being insulted isn't the worst thing. Losing yourself is—" The pilot's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching New York. Weather today is perfect." David looked down at the endless blue of the Atlantic below. He remembered it all. Karen's cold eyes, Gary's uneasy voice, the murmurs in the cabin. Now, they felt like old film reels, faded, distant, no longer painful, only meaningful. He murmured, half to himself, "No one truly wins a confrontation. Only those who turn it into a lesson become the lasting victors." When they disembarked, some passengers recognized them, but no one rushed over for photos. Only quiet nods, respectful smiles. An older man passing by whispered, "Thank you. You made me rethink how I treat people." David smiled and shook his hand. That was enough. That evening, back home, a handwritten letter awaited them from a high school in Atlanta. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, our students just finished a lesson on respect. We showed them the video of you being removed from your seats and asked, what would you have done?" One student stood up and said, "I wouldn't get angry because Mr. Carter showed that calm can be stronger than shouting." Monica's eyes filled with tears as she read. She looked up and whispered, "I think we've really taken flight now." Outside, the night spread across the city. A plane passed overhead, its beacon flashing in the dark sky. David stood by the window, watching it, his voice quiet but steady in the end. This was never a story about seats. It was a story about dignity, the one thing that can lift humanity higher than the sky itself. And so, their story closed not with applause, not with outrage, but with the dignified silence of two people who chose wisdom over anger. They didn't just reclaim justice. They charted a new flight path for the entire world. Respect is not something we're given. It's the way we choose to live. Sometimes, life throws us into moments that just aren't fair, where pride is stepped on, where people judge us by the color of our skin, our background, or even the seat we happen to sit in. But as the story of David and Monica Carter showed the world, real strength isn't found in how loud we shout. It's in how wisely we choose to stay calm. When they were dragged from their first-class seats, they could have screamed, sued, or fought back, but they didn't. They chose intellect over anger and turned humiliation into a wake-up call for the entire world. In the end, the very people who once looked down on them were the ones who had to bow their heads and learn what it truly means to respect another human being. The greatest lesson here isn't just for the airline industry. It's for every one of us. Dignity can't be bought with money, but it can be lost in a single glance. True justice isn't about revenge. It's about changing the world so no one else has to suffer the same pain. Diuki Mi. If you believe that respect is the foundation of every relationship in your work, in your family, and in your life, then hit like, share this video, and subscribe to help us spread more stories that move heart, stories of justice, of self-worth, and of the quiet strength that comes when people choose wisdom over anger. Hontefim, iem. Thank you for listening, because only when we truly listen to one another can the world begin to feel fair again.